Bangladesh, a nation born from struggle, found itself grappling with a new crisis in 2024. What began as student-led protests against a controversial job quota system quickly escalated into a nationwide movement, shaking the very foundations of the country's political landscape. The streets of Dhaka and other major cities became scenes of unrest, reflecting deep-seated societal grievances and raising concerns about the future of democracy in Bangladesh. As the situation spiraled, the world watched with bated breath, hoping for a swift and peaceful resolution to the crisis. The protests, triggered by the government's decision to reinstate and expand the quota system, exposed the raw nerves of a nation grappling with economic inequality, political polarization, and a perceived erosion of democratic values. The quota system, designed to benefit the families of 1971 Liberation War veterans, had long been a source of contention, seen by many as a symbol of unfair advantage and a barrier to merit-based opportunities. The government's miscalculation in reigniting this sensitive issue ignited a firestorm of anger and frustration, particularly among young people who felt increasingly marginalized and disillusioned. The crisis, however, was about more than just quotas. It laid bare the simmering discontent with the ruling Awami League government, accused of authoritarianism, corruption, and a failure to address the needs of ordinary citizens. The events of 2024 served as a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the importance of addressing social and economic inequalities to ensure lasting peace and stability. As Bangladesh navigates the aftermath of this turmoil, the world watches, hoping that this crisis can lead to meaningful reforms and a more inclusive and equitable society. To understand the 2024 Bangladesh crisis, one must delve into the history of the job quota system, implemented in the aftermath of the 1971 Liberation War. The quota system aimed to honor the sacrifices of the Mukti Bahini fighters and their families by reserving a percentage of government jobs for them. It was a well-intentioned policy, designed to support those who had fought for the nation's independence and provide them with opportunities in the newly formed Bangladesh. However, over the decades, the quota system became increasingly controversial. Critics argued that it had morphed into a form of institutionalized favoritism, perpetuating inequality and hindering merit-based advancement. The quota system, initially intended as a temporary measure, had become deeply entrenched, with successive governments reluctant to address the growing resentment and calls for reform. The system's critics, particularly students and young professionals, argued that it created an uneven playing field, where opportunities were determined by lineage rather than merit. They pointed to the fact that many beneficiaries of the quota system were now several generations removed from the Liberation War and no longer faced the same economic hardships. The quota system, therefore, became a symbol of a system perceived as rigged against those who were not part of the quota elite. The government's decision in 2024 to not only reinstate the quota system after a brief period of suspension, but to also expand its scope proved to be a fatal miscalculation, igniting the tinderbox of resentment that had been building for years. The spark that ignited the 2024 Bangladesh crisis originated on university campuses. Students, already grappling with limited job prospects in a highly competitive market, were outraged by the government's decision to reinstate and expand the quota system. They saw it as a direct assault on their aspirations, a move that would further diminish their chances of securing a decent future. The protests began peacefully, with students organizing marches, rallies, and sit-ins on campuses across the country. They demanded the immediate revocation of the quota system, calling for a merit-based system that provided equal opportunities for all. The students used social media effectively to mobilize support, their messages of anger and frustration resonating with a wider segment of the population who shared their concerns about inequality and a lack of opportunities. However, the government's initial response to the student protests was dismissive and heavy-handed. Rather than addressing the concerns raised by the students, the government sought to discredit and silence them. Police were deployed to break up demonstrations, using tear gas, water cannons, and brute force against unarmed students. These actions only served to inflame the situation, turning peaceful protests into violent clashes. The images of students being beaten and arrested by security forces were widely circulated on social media, further fueling public anger and drawing support from various sections of society, including teachers, professionals, and opposition political parties. Section 4. The nation erupts. Violence and political upheaval. As the government remained intransigent in its stance on the quota system, the protests spread like wildfire from university campuses to the streets of major cities across Bangladesh. What began as student-led demonstrations transformed into a nationwide movement, uniting people from all walks of life under the banner of demanding justice, equality, and an end to corruption. The protests, however, were no longer just about the quota system. They had become a lightning rod for a much wider range of grievances against the ruling Awami League government. People took to the streets to express their frustration with rising living costs, high unemployment, a perceived erosion of democratic freedoms, and the government's increasingly authoritarian tendencies. The situation quickly spiraled out of control as the protests turned increasingly violent. Clashes between protesters and security forces became a regular occurrence, resulting in numerous injuries and deaths. The government responded by imposing curfews, deploying the army, and shutting down internet services in an attempt to quell the unrest. The violence and chaos that engulfed Bangladesh sent shockwaves through the country and drew condemnation from the international community. Human rights groups accused the government of using excessive force against protesters and called for an independent investigation into the deaths and injuries. The crisis had plunged Bangladesh into a state of political turmoil, threatening its hard-won democratic gains and raising fears of a return to authoritarian rule. Section 5. Hasina's fall, resignation, and a power vacuum. As the 2024 crisis reached its peak, with the nation teetering on the brink of anarchy, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina made a dramatic announcement that sent shockwaves throughout Bangladesh and beyond. She was stepping down from power. The longtime leader, facing mounting pressure from both domestic unrest and international condemnation, chose to resign rather than risk further bloodshed and chaos. Hasina's resignation, while unexpected, was seen by many as an acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation and the government's inability to contain the protests through force alone. Her departure, however, created a power vacuum in an already volatile environment, raising concerns about a potential struggle for control and further instability. Her resignation, delivered in a televised address to the nation, was a somber affair. She expressed regret for the loss of life during the protests and acknowledged the genuine grievances of the people. However, she also defended her government's record, highlighting the economic progress made during her tenure and accusing her opponents of exploiting the situation for their own political gains. Despite her attempts to strike a conciliatory tone, Hasina's resignation did little to immediately quell the unrest. The protests continued, albeit with less intensity, as people demanded answers about the deaths during the crackdown and a clear roadmap for a transition to a new government.